So, good evening, everyone. Wonderful to welcome you to this course. I just wanted to give a little background about how these principles came to be. Um, Back in the mid 1990s, well, from the 80s through to around 2006, somewhere for about 25 years, I worked quite actively in the environmental movement as an activist, as a scientist and activist. And working primarily on strategies to abate global warming and to change energy policy away from fossil fuels and nuclear power to advocate for energy conservation and renewable energy. And in the course of that, I was also doing my own spiritual training extensively. I did a number of retreats with different spiritual masters, like particularly Buddhist masters initially, and then also with Thich Nhat Hanh. He did a series of retreats for environmentalists, which were really wonderful back in the late 80s and early 90s. And so I was doing this kind of dual work of doing this activism outwardly and doing my spiritual retreat work. And there came when after Bill Clinton and Al Gore were elected, there was a group of senior politicians in Washington, D.C., who wanted to convene a group to support their spiritual activism. They were all senior government officials who had gone to Washington to be part of the administration there, working on environmental issues. And obviously with Al Gore there was a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of work that was being done at that time on the environment. And so I was fortunate to get invited to be one of the co-facilitators of this group because I was a person who wasn't an activist myself, but I also had been heavily involved in spiritual practice for many years. And so I had kind of this requisite dual background. And so this work began in about 94, I think, roughly, and went for 2 or 3 years. And early on, after the first couple of retreats, we did generally one annual retreat a year and then sometimes a summer retreat. So it was a winter retreat and summer retreat was our primary gatherings. And then we had sometimes meetings in between. And after the first retreat or so, I was asked to compile a set of spiritual principles that would be palatable to people who didn't have any interest in religion, but really wanted the spiritual wisdom, to encapsulate spiritual wisdom without bringing religion into it. So that was the idea. And I put together some principles that were originally 8 principles, and then over the next year or two, they sort of grew to 13 principles. And so that's how this got started with these principles. And then we used these principles throughout that retreat time. And then afterwards, we continued to use them in our own work. And people found them helpful and valuable. And then they were picked up by other groups. And so we have sort of disseminated them to some degree to different groups. One in particular was Awakening the Dreamer, which is a group that was founded by Lynn Twist, and the whole movement that she started around awaking people up to, our reality and beginning to dream again, which came out of her work with the Pachamama Alliance and some of the indigenous shaman that she works with in Peru, who basically said that what needed to happen was that the North Americans needed a new dream. The dream that we had, essentially the American dream, was kind of the soul's nightmare in a way, the whole materialist dream, and that it needed to be replaced with another dream. So the idea was to awaken the dreamer to a whole different dream for the future of humanity. And so that was part of her work. And these principles were also picked up by other groups. We used them at the Global Eco-Village Network, and they were published in a book, and that's the link that we'll send you, that was co-authored by Maddie Harlan from England for the Global Eco-Village Network. And Maddie Harlan was the founder of Permaculture magazine. So that just gives you a little bit of background as to how these came about. But the basic idea behind them was to really articulate the essential need for doing inner spiritual work in order to be an effective agent of change outwardly. And there's a number of scriptural precedents for this. This is not really new at all. Although it seemed new at the time, it seemed, even to some of my colleagues, a little bit, I remember, for example, when I went off to spiritual retreats, when I was working at an activist center in Colorado, and some of my colleagues felt when I would go off to do a 7-day or 10-day retreat, that I was wasting my time, navel gazing, going off, and that there's only a small number of us, working for the cause. And so it's important not to waste your time, gazing at your navel, but to come here and keep going with the work to save the earth. But I felt very clear that this was part of the activism, and that it was very important for us to develop spiritually and internally, first of all, to get proper guidance, to be able to be connected to a deeper wisdom than our own mental machinations about what's needed. Secondly, to develop the capacities of compassion and skills for working with adversaries in a helpful way. Because in the nature of social change activism, we are often challenging other human beings about their ideas and their policies. And sometimes it's an out and out struggle to have our actions and our policies adopted, and working really at odds with other groups that are trying to have opposite policies adopted. And so it's very important coming into adversarial dynamics and adversarial domains, in congressional hearings, in policy debates before the World Bank and the IMF and other forums where I was often appearing as an environmental scientist. It was really important for me to develop a way of being in these challenges and in these environments and stay centered and maintain a kind of empathic commitment to holding the interests of everyone while at the same time being committed to a particular outcome. So that's one of the things that we'll speak to in this. And I was very inspired by Thich Nhat Hanh, who said at one point, he said, what we most need to do is to hear within ourselves the sounds of the earth crying. In other words, as environmental activists, we need to connect directly to the pain of the earth and be able to then listen to the wisdom in that pain. So that became a really important teaching for me, and it's one that I then later applied in our gender equity and reconciliation work, which was that what we most need to do as men, for example, is to hear within ourselves the sounds of the female gender crying. In other words, we need to hear that pain and take that pain in. Otherwise, we don't know how to be, how to act. And we need to have our empathic awareness and consciousness awakened. And so that was a very important part of what Thich Nhat Hanh spoke to that I found very powerful. He also said that if you want to take care of the environment, we must take care of environmentalists. And I began to realize how important that was in general. If we want to take care of these issues that are so important in terms of social change, we must also take care of those who are out there on the front lines, working to implement those changes, because it's challenging work, and it's draining, and it requires a kind of strength from within. We need to build up the inner strength. And so I began to work in that way myself. And then we began to organize a series of retreats for environmental activists, which we carried on for a number of years throughout the 90s and early 2000s. Things changed after 9/11 because the whole focus of our particular work shifted at that point. But we did these environmental retreats for many years. And so we applied these principles in that context. And I think I'll bring this little intro to a close with just a couple of basic teachings from the spiritual traditions. We will be drawing in wisdom from different sources and traditions as we move through these next 4 weeks and as we address these different principles. But one of the founding sort of core teachings comes from the great Christian mystic Meister Eckhart, the 13th century Dominican. But he said it so eloquently and beautifully. He said, unless the inner work is great, no, he said, the outer work will never be great if the inner work is small. And the outer work will never be small if the inner work is great. So in other words, if we don't do our inner work, then if we set out to accomplish something outwardly in the world, it is limited by the fact that we haven't completely done the transformative work within ourselves that will enable us to be used as an instrument of divine will, if you will. And that will enable us to get our egos out of the way, in which case we can be far more effective. And then the other part that he said, if the inner work is great, the outer work will never be small. If we do that huge and transformative work inwardly, then even if our outer work is doing, as Mother Teresa said, small things with great love, it has profound reverberations. And there's a way in which we are working in that flow of divine will and divine service. And in so doing, our work, the work that comes through us, is more how I would say it, is great, because it is really divine work. And we are then being used as the instrument for a work that's far larger than we are. And we will also find that we are able to do many things and accomplish a tremendous amount without trying that hard. It doesn't mean that we're not fully engaged and constantly moving and working, but we are resting in an eternal peace and we don't burn out. This is so, so important that we learn to do that two-step of how to step out into the world in service and then to step back and recharge our spiritual batteries. And when we can do that back and forth, we then develop this capacity, this kind of diastolic, systolic, and diastolic two-step, which Evelyn Underhill said was the mark of the greatest spiritual leaders across all of humanity. And I'll just close this little piece by a little story from one of our friends and colleagues, Eugene Callender, who was working in Harlem. He's a pastor, and very effective pastor. And he had all kinds of social programs for the poor and for the youth at risk. And these were vibrant programs that he was the director of, but he gathered lots of people around him who were actually carrying them out. And he was asked at one point, how do you do all this? How do you possibly do so much? And he said, I don't do anything. I just stand still and God pushes me around. And that's the ideal of spiritual activism, is that actually we are not doing anything ultimately, that we are simply implementing, as Sri Aurobindo says so beautifully, when we come fully into the deepest truth of spiritual activism, we become one with the divine presence, and really with the divine feminine, because the feminine is the agent of divine action in the world. And so the way he puts it is we become one with the divine mother so that her impulse and her consciousness comes through undistorted and unfiltered through us. So that's the prayer that I hold for myself, for the work that we do. And to do that, we need to stay attuned inwardly and keep doing that inner work and outer work and that two-step. It's like breathing. We breathe in. We are nurtured by that in-breath. If you didn't breathe in, you could never breathe out and you would die soon. And if you constantly tried to breathe out, you would suddenly be gasping for air. But if you have a rhythm of the breath, you stay centered, you stay peaceful, and you stay vibrant and alive. So that's the essence of the whole course right there. That's what the whole principles are about and the practices. So I think Cynthia is going to begin with going through the first principle, and then we're going to have some time in small groups to address these.
And I love Nancy, I love your dog. That's great. We got other beings on the call here, on the course. This is wonderful. Welcome to all who have just joined, and we also continue to invite the YouTube audience to join if you'd like. Garrett's put the link in your chat on YouTube if you want to join. I'm going to share my screen and bring up the first principle, and I'll read it, and then I'm going to share a little experience in my own life of how it relates to my life. Then we'll move into some small groups where you can share yourself. So let me do this. And there we go. So the first principle is transformation of motivation from anger, fear, despair to compassion, love, and purpose. This is a vital challenge for today's social change movement. This is not to deny the noble emotion of appropriate anger or outrage in the face of social injustice. Rather, this entails a crucial shift from fighting against evil to working for love, and the long-term results are very different, even if the outer activities appear virtually identical. Action follows being, as the Sufi saying goes. Thus, a positive future cannot emerge from the mind of anger and despair, from His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So, transformation of motivation from anger, fear, despair to compassion, love, and purpose. And Garrett's going to put that first principle in the chat box, so when you move into your groups, you'll still have it. But I just wanted to share briefly, some of you have heard one of my stories about, let me set my timer here so I don't go over time. So I've heard my story about making it through my master's degree in wellness management, gerontology, and I was just starting my career as a young woman. I had 2 children. I was divorced. I was ready to take on the world. I had been studying with a world-renowned health and wellness expert, and I had studied about him, and I was going to get to work with him then because I landed a job in Indianapolis in the States. And I worked there for 5 months. I was middle management. I was quite excited about it. I was going to start traveling with this world-renowned man, white man, Christian, 20, 30 years my senior, expert in the field. I was very excited. However, on a business dinner, he sexually propositioned me. He said, "Cynthia, I've enjoyed getting to know you. Now it's time to take our relationship to a deeper, more intimate sexual level." I said no, and he didn't hear my no. He continued to pressure me that evening, but also then throughout the week at work. And so I decided to bring it forward. And I did so with as much compassion in my heart, as much love in my heart as I could, knowing we're in a system and everything. And I just want to speak about being a white woman in the States, middle class, well, maybe lower middle class, being a single mom. But it was really the first time in my life that I had to really speak my truth against the patriarchal system, against the system that oppresses many. And it put me in a place of better understanding of what my brown and black sisters have gone through, and still not even being in the same place of privilege. I just want to name that because it is different around race and culture of how these things happen. But I brought it forward, and he apologized. I the corporation, though, I stayed for about a week, and it was horrific. I felt like my throat was going to get cut at any moment. I literally and figuratively. My emails were hacked personally. My mother's, my family's emails were hacked. The court, at one point, an anonymous person said that I was abusing my own children and they were bringing charges against me, things like this. I was losing everything. I was literally losing everything because of his actions. The corporation hired 6 attorneys to keep me quiet. And then they offered me $1,000 if I'd sign a memorandum saying I'd never speak about it again. And I chose to not take that money. It wasn't about me losing, and about me trying to be vindictive or anything. It was about speaking truth. And I wasn't out for blood. I really wanted change. But when I left that, when I got pushed out of that job, I couldn't trust men anymore. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to be around men, but I also couldn't trust women because they betrayed me too. They had to keep their jobs. And it took a lot of therapy, a lot of healing work. It took a few years of that to get through that process. And that this principle of turning, the anger that I had and the betrayal I had, the despair I had, into love and compassion and deeper understanding was the process I was in. So it didn't come easily, but it did happen. And ultimately, it led me into the work that I'm doing now with Will and our gender community. And so it reaped very beautiful, and it sowed great seeds, beautiful work to come. But I had to go through that process and not be angry about it, but really come to a deeper place of understanding. So that's an example of how it's worked in my life. You may not have something the same way. It may be something very different, or maybe you've witnessed someone in that place. It may be that it was with the whole community, or maybe you've seen it in world events or something like this. So you can take this wherever you feel you want to. And we're going to move into groups here in a moment. You'll have, I think, 20 minutes for the group. You'll be in groups of 4 and 3 or 4. I see people coming and going here, so I'm not sure how Garrett has it configured. Garrett will give you time markers as you go, just to kind of know, okay, should be the first, second, third. You might want to be in a discussion. If you want to do that, then just make sure everybody gets a chance to speak. Will, do you want to say anything else?
I don't think so, because I'll be speaking about the next principle. So,
okay. Is there any questions for clarity, or is everyone good to go?
Is there a specific question you want us to answer? Or is it more general? Like, do you want us to take an example that we've had in our own life?
Yeah,
Is that
more that, Nancy, and just how this principle maybe has been in your life, or how maybe you've never thought about it. So how is it hitting you now? How's it landing for you now? That kind of thing. And if you're on YouTube, we encourage you to stay on, but just maybe do some journaling around this, or take some time for reflection about it. And like I said, Garrett's put it in the chat so you can find it there, okay? The actual principle. We'll see you shortly.